Here we go then.
Hello and welcome to Take Back Your Cloud Environment, cleaning up Microsoft Teams and SharePoint sprawl. If you have been using Teams and SharePoint for the last couple of years, there's a chance, high probability actually, nearly every organization we've worked with where you might have some sprawl, and we're going to give you some tips and tricks on how to mitigate the sprawl as well as clean it up once it's happened. Hi, my name is Nate Austin. I'll be doing some facilitation today, but the primary presentation is going to be done by Nina, as well as produced behind the scenes by Stephanie. So thanks for joining us today. Moving on to some quick tips. One of the things, or quick takes, I guess, here, we always like to highlight a few items that we know you're going to get out of the session today. So one, we want to show you how you can prevent this from happening in the first place. Again, chances are you might already have some of this, and it's probably because some of these settings that we're going to show you aren't defined or aren't set in a way that prevents some of the sprawl. So we're going to show you that. We're also going to show you how you can review 365 reports to identify opportunities to clean up or consolidate. And finally, why is this important? It's because what we hear from people and end users when you switch and start using Teams and SharePoint is that they don't like it, or they resist it, or it's confusing or frustrating. And so ultimately this helps increase adoption and increase efficiency across your organization. So that's what you're going to get out of today's session. So before we get into the details, I always like to cover 1 minute about Mytech. We just hit on a little bit about us. We are not a training organization, although we do some training around 365 as evidenced by these videos. But we are a business and technology consulting organization that over the last 22 years of being in business, we've identified a proven way, a proven IT strategy that we know delivers consistent and reliable results for our clients. Ultimately, it helps them remove IT challenges so they can focus on the more important things about their business and be more adaptable to business challenges, such as a pandemic, for example, or now that we're finally getting over that, I hope, cross our fingers. Working together with our clients, they achieve 4 times more value and productivity from their IT investments. Now, we actually do have some data around that. So if you'd like to learn more, and if you'd like to hear how we might be able to help you with that, by all means, please raise your hand and give us a shout, and we'd love to chat with you. But that's not why you're here today. So let me pass it over to why you're really here, which is Nina, for the session of cleaning up your cloud environment. Take it away.
Thanks, Nate, and welcome everybody to Take Back Your Cloud Environment today. So just a quick look at the agenda for today. The purpose of this session is really to get control of your 365 environment. And as Nate alluded to earlier, why is that actually important? And one of the key factors there is if it's not intuitive, if it's really messy, if it's really confusing, then what typically happens is that users just stop using it, or they find alternatives which are maybe not the best alternatives, or there's just a whole bunch of frustration around it. So we're going to be looking at some tips on prevention, and then ultimately how to mitigate sprawl, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. All right, so the old saying goes, prevention is better than cure. So before you actually get into a position where there is sprawl, it's good to look at some tips or recommendations on how to not get there in the first place. So the first tip or the first recommendation is that your teams and your SharePoint structure should mirror your organizational design. So we usually use an org chart of some sort where we look at the different groups or departments within your organization, and we try to mirror the structure according to that as much as possible. In terms of the channels, we really try to go with a less is more approach. Fewer channels generally mean fewer clicks. So unless there's a really good use case for having a separate channel, one example I can think of is an HR team that maybe has a separate channel for recruitment, and there's a whole lot of documentation around that you want to separate out, then generally try to avoid having too many channels. So really the goal with your structure is that you're designing for the long haul. You don't want to create teams and channels that are going to be here today and gone next month again. The second tip here is to limit channel creation. And what I mean by that is by default, Microsoft has allowed anybody in Teams to create channels. So we definitely recommend that this is locked down. And as I'm going through some of these tips and steps throughout the presentation, I just wanted to make a note of the fact that there is a supporting document that I've listed all the steps in all the different slides. So that'll be available in this presentation or in the YouTube channel in the description. So yeah, really important to prevent anybody from just creating a whole bunch of channels. And again, those steps will be listed in the supporting documentation.
Hey,
The
Nina,
third
if
tip-
I may,
Yo.
let me interject really, really quick, because one of the things that you and I do a lot of work on this stuff, and one of the other challenges we see, it's not really a prevention piece, but it's a confusion piece relative to channels, is oftentimes people get confused about whether or not they should have a channel or have like a subfolder within an existing channel. And so sometimes even answering those questions for your team helps helps to minimize channel sprawl too. So I know you're gonna talk about the permissions to prevent that from happening, so anyone can do it. But that's one of the other challenges that we see, where is helping identify what those teams are, and that you can have folders without necessarily creating channels. So anyway, just a side note that's something that I know is a common question we get when we have these conversations with organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Nate. So yeah, the third tip here is to limit private channels. Private channels generally for administrators are a little bit of a nightmare to manage, excuse me, just because it's really only visible to the people within that channel or the participants in that channel. And the other thing to note here is that there's also reduced functionality. So a private channel, essentially all you can do is chat, do some meetings and collaborate on files. But you're actually there's other functionality like forms and planner that you're essentially eliminating by using a private channel. The fourth tip here that I'd like to give is that in terms of long-term structure, it is a good idea to utilize teams and channels. And the recommendation here is that typically your structure should look similar 6 to 12 months from now. Whereas if it's something more of a short-term project, or maybe a short-term conversation that will typically last a few weeks or maybe a few months at most, then it's more appropriate to use one-on-one chats or group chats. And it's quite easy to pin those in teams as needed, and when you don't need it anymore, just unpin it again. In terms of SharePoint sprawl, there's a couple tips here that I'd like to give you with regards to preventing it. The first tip here is, again, by default, Microsoft allows anybody to create a site in SharePoint. And so a good recommendation here is to have some sort of organizational policy around site creation that essentially only your SharePoint administrators or a SharePoint or 365 team are allowed to create sites. So that's a good tip there. Another one is that if there's any kind of change requests, like you want a new site created, or you want additional functionality in the SharePoint portal, that those change requests are submitted either to your IT department or to a SharePoint administrator. And the change request should include things like the site name, the purpose of the site. This is really important. Like, what is the use case for the site? The permissions, so who should be able to see and access what, and that there's some kind of an approval process whereby that person is informed of whether it's been approved or not. And lastly here, I really do recommend that that people keep good SharePoint documentation. So keeping track of your SharePoint sites, documenting permissions, that's a really big one. One big issue we see with most clients is that that's super difficult to track. Even, if you go into the sites or the document libraries, you actually have to go in them one by one, and there's no easy way to keep track of those permissions. So just keeping it in an Excel document, something simple, is a really easy way to track it. And we generally recommend a maintenance checklist, just a 1 or 2 page quick checklist that you can do maybe every quarter or once a year, just to see that everything is clean and where it's supposed to be.
Nina, can I
Sure.
raise a hand on that? On that last slide. So I think this is one of the things that that Nina's done a great job introducing relative to our engagements with folks is really having some sort of the concept of governance. So part of that documentation is what you're talking about, is that, and I know I'm not trying to steal your thunder, but I feel it's worth mentioning here, is that, when you, I know it sounds like it could be tedious to document this information, like what are our SharePoint sites or the libraries or who has access and those kind of things. But if you really want to try and iterate and make sure that as your organization changes, as Microsoft changes, because guess what, Microsoft makes changes on a regular basis too, this governance and having some rhythm, whether it's quarterly or semi-annually, or at least annually, is a great way to identify those adjustments that you can make over time. And so highly, again, this is one of those things that's an afterthought and most organizations don't do, but it's a great, and it is extra work. I will acknowledge that, but it does I think really help over time keep your environment serving your organizational needs, which is really the ultimate goal. So sorry for the interjection, but I thought that was worth an honorable mention there.
And, to your point, Nate, it doesn't have to be complicated. I mean, it could be an Excel workbook, one tab for your team structure, one tab for your SharePoint structure with just the name, who has permissions to the sites and maybe some information around the document libraries. I find the simpler, the better. And once you have it, it's just some minor adjustments throughout the year to keep track of it. So it doesn't need to be complicated. All right, so now we're looking at our teams and our SharePoint environment are already out of control. Now, what do we do? How do we mitigate this? So the first step I want to look at here with Microsoft Teams, and this is done in the Teams Admin Center. So I just want to call out the fact that you would need to be a global administrator or a Teams administrator. So if you don't have those privileges, I would just reach out to the administrator to get some of these reports. They're not too difficult to get. And again, step-by-step instructions will be included. So if we look in the Teams Admin Center under the Manage Teams option, I can get a list of the different teams that I have. And when I click into those particular teams, I can look at the team members, owners, and the different channels. So the first step here would be to review those teams, channels, and members and ask yourself the following questions. Does the structure mirror your organizational design, as we mentioned earlier? Or are these just teams that were created randomly on the go? Maybe, people were just, a free-for-all, and there's just a bunch of different teams in there that don't really make sense. The second thing is, does the naming convention make sense? Or are they weird names and they're like John's test team that nobody really knows what's happening in that team? Are the channels appropriate, and are the number of channels appropriate? So do those channels really make sense for that team? And the other thing there is, are there too many private channels, as we mentioned earlier? A very important piece here is, are the team owners and the team members up to date? Maybe team members have moved to other teams or left the organization entirely. We want to make sure that the right people have access to the right information in the right team.
And Nina, I'll interject here too, is that we've found that by doing this, that two things have happened that have really surprised some of the, typically we're dealing with operational folks in the organization, leaders of the organization, department heads of the organization, and they find that there are teams that exist that they didn't even know existed in the organization, right? One of my favorite ones that it was called Shark Stuff. I won't name the organization, but it was fun when we found that and we went through that with that organization. And the other one is that when department heads have private channels on their team that they are not aware are even there because someone else created it and didn't invite the department head to the private channel, which means that the department person who's ultimately accountable for that department doesn't even have awareness and visibility to things that are going on in their department, which is typically not. I don't know. If I was the department head, I wouldn't appreciate that. I wanted at least have some visibility to it or awareness of it. But anyway, so this is why this step's really important, is to get visibility because you might have visibility to everything, but this verifies and gives you visibility to everything that exists so that you can make sure that you can make adjustments as needed. There's almost always surprises.
Always. All right, the second step here is that I would look at the team's usage, and to be able to access that is again in the Teams Admin Center under Analytics and Reports and Team Usage. Now, looking at this report, there's a couple things that already stand out to me. If I look here on the right-hand side, I can see, and usually these usage reports, by the way, are for the past 90 days. And just looking at that green column over there, I can tell that there hasn't actually been any activity in these teams since May, June, and July. The other thing that kind of stands out to me here is the fact that nobody's been posting any messages, nobody's been replying to any messages, and there haven't really been any meetings organized. So there's two things here that stand out to me. First of all, is is the reason that people are not using these teams because of a lack of training or confusion? Are they maybe not sure how to access it? Is there some kind of additional support that we can give them so that they utilize it more effectively? Or is it maybe that there's no need for these teams anymore? You know, if I'm looking at the MTS example team, maybe there really is just an opportunity there for consolidation and cleanup. All right, if we're looking at SharePoint, there's a very similar report in the SharePoint Admin Center under active sites on the left pane, and a very similar story that I'm picking up here. If I look again at the green column that says last activity date, I mean, these sites haven't been really visited since 2020 and 2021. Very few page views and visits or files viewed or edited. And again, is that maybe, I have to ask myself, is that perhaps because there's more training required around the SharePoint portal? Maybe there's content in there that's no longer up to date, so nobody's visiting the site? Or is it just a matter of that the site is just no longer needed?
You know, if I may go back to that one really quick, one of the things that we also found here too is that the concept of using communication sites and team sites typically get used because they're associated with their team, but we found that there's also confusion between why would you have a communication site and departments that we would call shared services like HR or marketing or finance. I'm trying to think of another one, recruiting, maybe, you know, this falls under HR, but anyway, IT is another one. Those oftentimes do have communication sites, but not all teams have communication sites. And so one of the things we found with other organizations we've worked with is where they had a process to for every department to have a communication site, but they didn't really have a good reason to use it. And it felt really duplicative as far as publishing things to the communication site. So anyway, there's things that were found that it wasn't necessarily that a communication site didn't exist or a team site didn't exist. It's just that the original purpose and how they thought it was going to be used ended up not working. And because it was extra effort and extra work and it didn't really have a good business problem that it was solving, it ended up being kind of a waste. And so it had a great start, but then over time it just diminished because operationally it didn't make sense. So it's just, these are just these indicators that Nina is showing you doesn't necessarily answer which way to go. Is it, what problem are you trying to solve as far as, is it a process thing? Is it a training thing? Is it a duplication thing? Is it not really solving a business problem? But it just allows you to hone in on the key areas where you can start asking those questions, right? Where you can start thinking through those variables. Is it a process thing, et cetera? So, or should it be consolidated? Has your organization changed? So anyway, those are just some ideas that examples that we have found when we worked with other organizations relative to assessing this data. Doesn't necessarily tell you what the problem is. It just allows you to start asking the questions to hopefully find it out.
And there's one other key variable there, Nate, that I think we run into time and time again, and that oftentimes the big issue or the big challenge around these SharePoint portals is just a lack of good navigation. So if people are not even able to find these sites in the first place,
it's a great point.
you know, then and it's kind of like they're hidden, or if they haven't visited these sites at all, it doesn't show up in the default SharePoint navigation. And so we did do a video about a month ago on creating some good navigation in your SharePoint portal, and that might be another way to just increase some visibility into those sites, you know, if that is kind of identified as what the issue might be.
You're absolutely correct, Nina. Especially one of the things that we hit on over and over and over again is new employees in particular. Like you bring on a new person on your team, and if they just go to SharePoint, they see nothing. If they just click on SharePoint in the Office 365 portal, they don't see anything because they haven't been to any SharePoint sites yet. But if you create that navigation, it'll help them go to all the information and have the information at their fingertips that's applicable to them based on their login. So yeah, that's an excellent point.
All right, so just a couple of final tips here in summary. The first tip that I would give is that it really makes sense to assemble a 365 team. You know, even if it's just a team of 2 or 3 people, you know, for one people to try to maintain all of this is a lot. It is challenging. so that the team could potentially help assist with the maintenance piece and also with change requests, maybe even creating some of these sites, creating some of that navigation we just spoke about. So it really does make sense to identify a small group of people to assist with some of this. The second thing, again, maintenance doesn't sound like the most exciting thing, but if there's a regular cadence, like if it's every 6 months or annually, and that documentation is kept up to date, it doesn't have to be a super complicated issue. It's kind of like Nate and I were just discussing, it's kind of like our closets at home. Once they're in a good place, it's better to keep them there rather than wait 2 years, to have to go do that cleanup from scratch again. So a regular schedule is a good idea, and some kind of a cleanup checklist, even if it's just a one-pager checklist, to make sure that we're consistently checking the same things. The third thing here is to use those 365 reports I just mentioned. There are some additional reports, but I didn't want to dig into too much detail today. But these reports are super useful to help make informed decisions around your structure, around your cleanup, and potentially where there's kind of adoption issues. And that again would help identify training opportunities for staff as well. So if there's confusion, maybe it's not the structure per se, maybe it's just a lack of understanding of how everything fits together. And lastly, the documentation piece. So the 365 structure, any permissions, any changes to those permissions, and I promise just keeping that up regularly just makes maintenance in general just so much easier. And, so the reason we've been talking about all of this, why good planning is important, and why the good structure is important, is that without it, users will just be so much less inclined to even use your 365 structure to begin with. So we want to make sure that by creating an easy to understand, intuitive, clean structure, we know that there'll be adoption and that people will actually be making use of your 365 environment the way they should be.
And Nina, I think one of my favorite parts about the reports is that you can start tracking the adoption. So it's not just an anecdotal look over people's shoulder, I think people are using it, but not only to use those reports for the cleanup or to maintenance, but really seeing that we're actually driving adoption. We're seeing that people are using the tools. It gives you real data to do it. And that it builds a great foundation, which it's not the topic of this session, but it's really when we engage folks, it's the next layer. Once you have this structure really in a good place, then you can start layering all the other productivity enhancing pieces to this structure. And so you can also start tracking adoption of those tools as well. So those reports show you utilization, not because you're trying to put your thumb on anybody, it's just, it helps you identify these opportunities and helps you see that you are actually making an impact and you are making a difference and hopefully making it fewer clicks for your team to do their job, which for us is ultimately what we try and help people do, because everyone wants, fewer clicks to do your job. So next, so I was going to say, please, one of the things that we always ask people, like, look, if you want to get updated on this information, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on LinkedIn. That's where we post all this information. If there's anybody that you know that might benefit from these, we do these for free because we really try and encourage people to self-service if they can, if you feel comfortable with it. That's why we give all this information and guides, especially once you see that checklist that Nina's put together that Stephanie linked in the Q&A panel, as well as that will be linked online. Share it if anyone you think could benefit. We'd love to have you at future events. We do have every other month Power User Group sessions that go a little bit more of a deeper technical dive. And of course, we always say, look, if you want help or if you feel like you need some questions, raise your hand. We're happy to see if we can help work with you on these challenges. Because it's complex, it's really complex. And so when we always learn something every single day, we almost run across a scenario that a client brings up that we're like, no one's really asked us that yet, because there's all kinds of different ways in which this stuff gets applied. So we're always happy to help if that makes sense. But let's probably open it now for some Q&A. And so I'd like to, for those of you listening right now, go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A panel, and we'll get those answered. But there was one that came up through the session, Nina, that I wanted to throw your way. Can you just, and I tried to answer it via text, but I know that never does it justice. So can you, there's a question that said, should folders or channels mirror your organizational structure? And I quickly replied, well, really at the Teams level of Teams, again, thank you, Microsoft. The Teams application, the Teams section of Teams is really where that should mirror the design. But how does that layer into the folders? I don't know. Elaborate a little bit more on that relative to mitigating sprawl.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question, and I think it vastly just depends from organization to organization. Like, we've worked with many different companies who do it in very different ways. Some companies, as they're migrating their data off of their on-prem file server, will try to mirror some of that design. So I think it's less, I think once it gets to kind of that level, as Nate mentioned, I think the Teams level, it's important to have that mirror your organizational design, but I think the folder structure itself is probably going to look different, between organizations. The other question there is, some organizations like to leverage some of the new 365 capabilities using metadata instead of using folders. So it really ends up being more of a personal preference. And that's just some of the things that we kind of help talk through with clients, that ask that exact same question. So it's difficult without knowing your particular business needs to have a really good answer for that. But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell.
Yeah, and that's something that it's part of it is even creating the awareness or having the awareness that when you create a team, it creates the site. When you create a channel, it creates a folder. And I know I'm using specific words that Microsoft uses. When you create a channel, it creates a folder in the default document library of that SharePoint site. And so and some people don't realize that you can create a folder there without creating a channel. So a channel might make sense. An example that Nina and I have used before is when you're talking about an HR team, you always have the default general channel, but maybe it makes sense to have a recruiting channel because there's a lot of correspondence and conversation around recruiting that happens. And so having a separate channel for that and its corresponding folder might make a lot of sense. But maybe you just need a subfolder for it. I'm not sure. That's a decision for you to make. But the other thing, as Nina mentioned, relative to metadata, again, we don't know specifically how it applies to your organization, is that using SharePoint lists, we've also done sessions that talk about finding your files faster with SharePoint lists, where you can, instead of using a folder and a subfolder, you can create criteria or attributes, generally referred to as metadata, that you can then say, instead of tagging it with a year as a folder, maybe a year as metadata, or a meeting date. Instead of a meeting date folder, maybe a meeting date is the criteria. But then you can start creating a structure that is not folder based. It's usually a combination of folder based and metadata based in your environment. So it's really creating awareness around what's possible, and then applying it to your operational need and the specific problem you're trying to solve. And I'll be quiet and open it up for some other questions here. But the last comment I have relative to the what problem are you trying to solve is that we challenge folks all the time, and on our team internally as well as with clients, is if you can be clear on the problem you're trying to solve, because there's lots of features, there's lots of ways in which you can solve these different problems inside of Teams and 365 or other tools. But when you're very clear about the problem you're trying to solve, it usually becomes more evident which way inside of those tools fits you best. And so those are the reasons why we like to phrase it that way, is not just doing things for the sake of doing things, because it actually is solving a problem. And ultimately, we feel that when you are clear on that, it also helps drive the adoption that we're trying to accomplish through sessions like this too. So yeah, I don't know, Nina, any other thoughts on that before we move to another question?
No, sounds good to me.
All right. So another question that came up that I'd like to ask is, you talk about these reports. Mm-hmm. How do you, like most people don't have access to them. So what's your best recommendation to get them, to view them? I don't know, have you any tips or tricks on that?
I mean, I would just, work directly with who the admin is. I've had to do that with our clients on a regular basis. And I think that's, those instructions that I posted would be helpful for that, so that they know exactly where to go and what to get. Yeah, so it is difficult. I do have situations like that where I don't actually have admin access into the 365 environment. And yeah, it's just a matter of just working closely with whoever that admin is and making the right requests, essentially. Like this is the data that I want. This is where it, where you can get it. And that seems to work quite well.
Gotcha. Okay. Very good. I think you covered the default settings that it was one of the things that I liked highlighting, and I don't know if it makes sense pulling up the document if you have it readily available, but that one of the things that by default, this baffles me. There's things that Microsoft does by default that I think is really great, and there's things that Microsoft does by default that are a little bit challenging, or again, I'm not saying I'm no more than Microsoft, because that's definitely not true, but this is one of those around the member settings, about in a team and the member settings that are default turned on. I wonder if you might be able to show that. This is an example of that document that Nina was talking about. But Nina, can you walk us through that real quick?
Yeah, so I've essentially cut off the team piece here, but if you go to the team name on the left-hand side in Teams, and there's like the little 3 dots or the breadcrumbs, and you go there and you go to manage team, and go into the settings piece and look at member permissions. These are the check boxes that by default are enabled. And so I would definitely uncheck these so that we're not allowing members to create and update channels, to delete them.
Can you make this a little bit bigger, Nina?
Sure.
Maybe. Yeah, there you go. Because it's hard to read on the screen. So there you go. Thank you. Can you walk through that? Thanks.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, just click on the team name, the breadcrumbs next to the team name, go to manage team, click here on the settings tab, and then just open up the member permissions and uncheck. I'll just make them a little bit bigger here as well. And uncheck these boxes here so that people aren't able to go and create and update channels, create private channels, and all of those things that we mentioned.
Yeah, and by default, those are all turned on.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I've even had folks, in fact, a lot of times in the teams that I'm responsible for, I uncheck all of them but the last box. I want people to be able to edit their messages but not delete them. And sometimes creating an update and removing connectors is something you may or may not want to. So, but this is where Microsoft turns all this on by default. And so you have to go to, if you're and you also have to be an owner of the team as a side note. If you're not an owner of the team, you don't see this. But if you're an owner of the team, you can actually go in and change these settings, but by default, these are all turned on. So this is a simple trick. We always like to do a little public service announcement relative to that, so that you can, you could go right now, if you're an owner of one of your teams in your environment, you could go look at this, manage the team, click on settings, go to member permissions like Nina just showed you, and you could see what you've got selected. We usually recommend, again, turning off most of them, not necessarily all of them, but most of them, like Nina's illustrating here. And it's just something that can help mitigate the sprawl. Because if these were turned on by default, you might have private channels in your team that you're responsible for managing that you don't have access to. And that's, again, one of the risks that we found that out by doing a training with a client that several years ago when we learned that this was turned on by default. So good question. I appreciate you asking, because this is something that a lot of this stuff you require global admin access, or you need to really go collaborate and figure this stuff out. But this is something you could do right now in checking all your teams to see if there's a member permissions you want to adjust. So. Well, that's it. I don't see any other questions posted or in the Q&A or in the chat here. So I don't know, any final thoughts before we sign off, Nia?
No, I think we covered quite a bit today.
All right, well, thanks everyone for attending. We really appreciate your time, and we will be publishing this to our YouTube site, as well as with a link to download the document, which is the checklist that Nina just showed a couple bits of it, but every single piece we went through as far as what we recommend, how to run the reports, how to change the settings, Nina's outlined in that document. We figured that might be a good takeaway as opposed to just giving you the demo on this video. So hopefully it's very valuable to you, and we look forward to seeing you again on a future session. Thanks a lot and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.